You're listening to the Anxious Scholar Podcast, a podcast for anxious scholars. If you're a high school student who can't wait to go to university, but also is kind of overwhelmed with lots of unanswered questions like me, then you've definitely come to the right place. On this podcast, I sit down with EGM alumni while they share valuable advice from this exciting journey of theirs that we have yet to take. I really hope you'll enjoy this episode and learn lots of useful information about the college application process, unis, and higher education in general. Okay, well, hi Sascha. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this interview. Thank you for welcoming me on this campus. It's a beautiful day. We're really lucky, so I'm really excited to start. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to be here and happy you're doing this for UGM. So my name is Sascha. I grew up in New York City. I'm half American, half Russian, and I moved to Paris when I was 16. And I did my last 3 years of high school at UGM, where I did the International Baccalaureate. And I decided to come here to École Polytechnique, where I'm doing the Bachelor of Science, which is a 3-year double major program where you take math in all 3 majors and one of either physics, economics, or computer science. And the first year you take all 3 majors with the option to specialize a little bit in the second semester. And then the next years you specialize in one of the 2 majors, and then the third year you also have an exchange program where you get to go abroad potentially. Yeah, that's kind of a very brief overview of myself.
Yeah, 16 years in America, yeah. What would you say are kind of the main differences between the systems of education in France and the US?
It's hard to say because most of my education in France was a relatively Anglo-Saxon one. Like doing the International Baccalaureate at UGM, I wasn't necessarily exposed to extremely French style of education. However, I would say that École Polytechnique is actually quite French.
Right.
And we are the international ones on an extremely French sort of establishment and institution, really. And it shows within the teaching, I would say. It is a much less, I would say, I don't want to say positive outlook necessarily, but it is much more work intense, and it is much more rigorous, I would say, especially within mathematics. In America, I would say you can get away with a lot of different, I'd say less rigor in your mathematical thinking, and being here really forced me to I don't know, to make my thinking more sort of clear, and also to be much more like precise and exact in sort of what I'm writing. It's a little bit more demoralizing at times, I'm not going to lie.
Mm-hmm.
I have gotten some of the worst grades of my life while here.
Yeah.
And that was definitely quite a shocking experience, I think, compared to the US, where you're much more encouraged, and I think on average your grades are much higher, especially when I'm comparing with my friends in the US right now, who tell me about their grades, and I'm like, I'm happy with my 10 out of 20.
Right.
And yeah, and I would say also there's much less focus on extracurricular activities here. Even here at École Polytechnique, there's less focus on that compared to a US college, where you will have way less credits to take. Like here, for example, I'm taking 34 credits currently, and my friends in the US per semester would take about 16. So our class time is exponentially higher. I end in June. My friends just ended now in April. And you have a much more intense work schedule. I would say like a lot of our time is spent working.
And that's even the case, even though you're taught in English, because the bachelor program is totally in English.
Yeah, so I mean, it's an international program, and the majority of people here, like the student body, is very diverse. They're from all around, but the teaching side, it is École Polytechnique, and the professors majoritarily are French. Some of them are not French, but mostly I would say they're French, and they teach to the cycle ingénieur. The way the school is sort of set up is that we're on a much larger campus called IP Paris, which encompasses about 6 schools. There's École Polytechnique, Télécom Sud, Paris Mines, ENSTA, and SAI, and they're all different scientific schools. And then there's École Polytechnique itself, within which you have the Bachelor program, which is the international one that I'm in. And then there's the Cycle Ingénieur, which is the prépa, and then Cycle Ingénieur program. And so we share that program with them. And so the professors teach them as well, and that's why we get sort of a sort of dual kind of, French education in a way as well, just taught in English instead.
And are they on the same campus as here as you, or is it in a different location?
Yeah, so the campus, everything that we're at right now is École Polytechnique. The only thing that's different is that the engineers have a different housing section than the bachelors. The bachelors have their own building, and the engineers have their own buildings as well.
How's that different, engineers and bachelors?
So the engineers, they are actually part of the military.
Right.
They have a very strange schedule where they do 6 months of either military or civil service, and then afterwards they come to the campus and they do their I think it's about 2 years of actual schooling, and then they leave to do an internship abroad. And whereas and so it's completely separate. And they have their French education. They did their prépa, and the bachelors are completely different. We're younger than them because they've all done their 2 years of prépa before.
They're already called engineers because they've done the prépa.
Yeah, I mean, the reason they're called engineers is because they get a uniform. I don't know if you've ever seen the uniform, but they get a uniform. They have a hat. They have a sword. It's very sort of coveted and very I would say sought after. Like, it's a very French traditional kind of thing. They march during the défilé of the Bastille Day. So. And
you don't have any of that of the
no,
military
we don't
stuff.
have any of that. No.
Yeah, but that's true. It's a very big distinction and a big part of their lives.
Yeah.
It's actually a fun historic fact. It was created by Napoleon, and right around the start of when the school was created, which is a long time ago, 1794. So. That's it's interesting to talk about the differences between the two programs and to kind of understand, because some people might be confused. It's a fairly new program. It's getting really popular. Like you mentioned before that you said 11 people from our school, from your promo, decided to do the bachelor program. So before we continue our interview, I was wondering if we could go through some burning questions for my followers. So basically, I asked them if they had any questions for you for a bachelor in Polytechnique, and my first follower was wondering about the moyenne in math that you have to get. So you told me that you did IB, so it's definitely different. Could you tell us a little bit about how that works with the higher levels, how many you could choose?
Sure.
And which ones did you choose for, considering that you wanted to do this subject?
Sure. So I would say the Bachelor is a little bit less transparent with their admissions process and specifically what kind of grades they're looking for. In the UK, you have your very specific sort of grade requirements of we want a 7.76. I don't know if you know how IB works, but
I think it's out of 7. The 7 is the highest grade.
Yeah, 7 is the highest grade, and you have 6 subjects in total. And certain schools in the UK, just like they would require a certain moyenne, they require a certain amount of grades in your higher level subjects or standard level subjects or overall points. Considering that I wanted to do aerospace engineering, which is what I applied for in the UK, or engineering programs in the US as well, I took HL Math and HL Physics. I'll be very honest, I just didn't like chemistry, so I took it at standard level.
Yeah.
And I took HL History, and then I took SL English and French. And I would say that the Bachelor looks for excellence in math. I think math is the most important part no matter what.
Yeah.
And so they're going to look at your grades. Usually I would say, I can't remember how far back I submitted, but I would say you want your grades to be good in math starting from seconde. And I would recommend getting extra math help because especially here you will understand. I have on average about 2 to 3 math classes per semester. And they're quite demanding, and if you haven't really had the mathematical background and sort of rigor to starting from before, it'll be very tough to keep up. It'll be tough to keep up even if you have that extra help. So, they want that math level not only so that you can keep up in the bachelor program, but also you need it for the interview. So yeah, I would say excellence in math is the most important part, and then some sort of passion for science. Because again, it doesn't have to be physics, it doesn't have to be computer science, it could be economics as well. You just need to have a quantitative mindset, because even the economics here is quite quantitative.
Right. That's why That's what you mentioned about the programs they get to choose in second and third year. There's math everywhere. So math or physics, math physics, math computer science, math economics.
Yep.
So math is really
math is the core of the program.
Okay. So thanks for precising that. Another person was wondering about the social life and how your school impacts it. This person might have thought about prépa.
Okay.
But I think it can also apply to this program. It's obviously rigorous, like you said. Your grades, they're not what you expected. So how does that work with your social life?
Sure.
If you have something to say about that.
Yeah. So I would say I love it here. And I think the people here are some of the most diverse, most interesting, intelligent, passionate, kind people that I've ever met. I think one of the both benefits and drawbacks of being on a campus like this that's quite isolated, I would say, it's not difficult to get to Paris, but it's quite annoying. But that means that like within the Bachelor, we all live in one building and we're quite small also. So the community spirit that it breeds is like immaculate. Like we have a really, really strong community spirit. The events that we have are super, super nice. Again, the people here are, like my roommates. One of them is Armenian. One of them is French. One of them is Serbian. My friends are like Italian, French, American, just really from all over. And I think it's super, super interesting. You constantly hear about people's experiences from different places. And yeah, I think the only thing is that like you work a lot, and sometimes that can be tough. But the thing is, it doesn't take away, I think, from the social life that we all have. Compared to prépa, I think I don't know a lot about the prépa system, but I know that it's quite cutthroat. The competition is very high, especially because the rankings are what you're competing with your classmates to get into the top schools, which is not the case here. I can't say that there's any kind of sense of competition here. Everyone is very supportive. Everyone is trying to get through the program sort of together. And yeah, I think the community spirit here is excellent. So I would say the social life is great, just apart from the fact that Paris is not very close.
Right. Yeah, I've heard that. I've read about the community and that there's like 80% of international students, like you said. What about the campus? There's a lot of facilities, to do sports, a lot of opportunities to do that. I think it's really important to be able to balance that out with the work you do and getting some sports in. So what do you do personally here?
Yeah, so the sports facilities are quite excellent here, I would say. It being a military school, the focus on sports is quite high. I think I'm like one of the only people that I know out of my friends that has mandatory physical education. We have mandatory sports classes.
Right.
I do swimming and running. And so there's a track, there's a pool. There's also an association of École Polytechnique that you can sign up to do extra sports. There's a gym, there's a climbing facility. I do tennis on the weekends. There's obviously the pool, like do extra swimming there. What else is there? There's boxing. Yes, there's polo, there's horses, there's rugby. There's rowing also on the lake. I don't know if you see. But there's really plenty of sports activities that you could do on campus. The facilities are really great for that.
Do you have an idea of how big it is?
Just the campus itself?
Yeah, like size-wise.
That's a great question. Honestly,
I'll look it up, but that's interesting because the amount of things there is, it must be really big.
The thing is also like what you have to remember is that we're on the thing called the Plateau de Saclay, which is a lot of different schools. Like there's IP Paris, but then in addition to that you have ENS, you have Université de Paris-Saclay, and they're all sort of like together. So you're on this kind of like ginormous college. It's not a campus necessarily, but a sort of like area of like lots of subsets of campuses together.
Like a university community.
Yeah, in a way. Yeah. So there's a bus also that goes around to the other universities that are close by.
Yeah, so they make it practical to get here.
Yeah.
Right. So before we get into what I wanted to talk about is the application process. So you mentioned there's an interview. So definitely it's a specific kind of process because it's not like the normal prépa. But before talking about that, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the IB program because I've never had guests who did IB. So how does that work? Do you get to drop your higher levels? When do you have your exams? Because that's something you do at Spécialité. You choose 3 and then you
Yeah.
drop 1. So.
Yeah, so the IB program, you take 6 subjects, at least at UGM. I'll make it specific to UGM. You take 6 subjects, of which you take 3 higher level subjects and 3 standard level subjects. The higher level subjects just means that you'll have extra class time and extra, usually extra material, not necessarily higher in difficulty. Sometimes higher in difficulty, I would say, especially in math, it's higher difficulty. But in other classes like history, you'll just have extra material to cover. Our exams are done my exams were done in April and May. I believe now, I was the last year that still had COVID amendments. I believe that the new people have extra work to do than we did. But yeah, so you have your 6 subjects plus a bunch of, you have exams that you submit, but then you also have some coursework that is graded by the actual International Baccalaureate. For example, you'll have an extended essay, which is a 4,000 word like research paper that you write over the course of the 2 years, and you also have internal assessments, which are sort of mini little essays that you write for numerous classes. You might have an oral as well for your language classes. Yeah, I would say that sort of sums up the IB program, and the majority of it is all taught in English except for your French class.
And was that something that you found similar to the American system of education with the the long essays? Because for OIB, it might be kind of not, people might not be familiar with this kind of work. It's much more independent. That's what I've heard.
Yeah, I do think that it's quite similar to what I was used to in the U.S. In comparison to some of the, like, I don't know, dissertations that I heard people were writing in the OIB. We had, for example, I think some of your, like, history backs or something like that are, like, more than 4 hours long. Maybe that's philosophy.
We don't actually have that anymore because of the BFI bac, which is basically now called Bac Français Section Internationale Section Américaine. So what they did is they added APs, and now the AP Geography or History is going to account for our bac.
Okay, that's different, yeah.
Right, so now we're not going to have to...
That's very different,
but it's definitely a big part of the French bac.
But just in comparison to those, like, sort of, like, long essays, we had, like, 45-minute exams, maybe, which is short and stressful in a different kind of way. Yeah, I don't know. I think it's a much more Anglo-Saxon approach to education, just in terms of, the less focus on philosophy, less focus on, I don't know, I guess, quote unquote, classical literature and stuff. You have much more freedom within the kinds of subjects that you're learning, or at least the teachers that choose the subjects, and you have much more independence as well. You're definitely expected to sort of know how to work a little bit on your own, and if you don't, you'll end up struggling, I think.
What do you think about the essays in math? I've heard that you have to, like, write essays for your math subject. Is
here?
No, like in IB.
Oh, in IB. Oh, yeah. So that's the internal assessment.
Right.
I actually did my extended essay in math as well.
Right.
I mean, it's a new exercise. You try to write the thing is, you're not going to invent any kind of new math. So usually what you do is you either find a novel problem or some sort of mathematical subject that you're interested in, or a proof, or it could be any of those kinds of things, and you take about, like, I don't know, 10 pages, I would say, to write a sort of report on it, and usually with some sort of personal twist. I think those are the most interesting ones, is where you add some kind of, like, personal question or something like that to the essay, and then you investigate it through a mathematical lens.
But it's mainly assessed on, like, your math skills or your like, the way you write?
It's a mix of both. It's a mix of both. I mean, the math has to be at the level that you're expected to be at, but at the same time, they know that you're not going to invent something new, so whatever they're assessing, they're taking that into account, and they take the level of the math plus the level of the analysis as well. The analysis is, I would say, even more important, is the fact that you understand what you're talking about.
I find that fascinating because I've never, had that or won't have that in BFE, but I think it's really interesting. It's a kind of a different kind of creativity that you're asked to show.
Yeah, no, it was interesting.
Okay, and so you also mentioned that you applied to the US, the UK, and France, so Polytechnique. Would you say the IB program is more kind of valued in the US, or it doesn't change anything?
I don't think it changes anything. I would say, actually, if anything, I think there were more OIB acceptances to Ivy League schools in my year. I don't think it matters at all. I mean, the BFE is new also, but like I'm sure that it's the same. I think the U.S. schools value. I mean, as most schools do, they just value your academic record and and how intelligent and capable you are, and so that's not going to change whether you did the IB or the French bac. As long as your level of English is fine, you're good.
And do you mind telling us a little bit more about this process? Because it's definitely, I've heard that it's really hard to do both, like UK and the US at the same time, and France also. So how did that work for you? When did you start, this whole process, and what universities did you apply to?
Yeah, personally, I would actually suggest not spreading yourself so thin. Um, so especially because all of the different application processes happen in sort of different waves, but like they happen all at the same time, especially during terminal, where especially for IBs, the beginning of terminal is quite rough in terms of workload. Um, so, so I'll start with the UK. The UK is where I applied to first because I applied to Cambridge. I didn't get in, but so that process starts around, I would say, September and October, and I would suggest also if you're interested in Oxford, you should prepare even earlier, especially if you want to do science. Their engineering tests are quite insanely difficult. And then in the UK, I applied to Cambridge for engineering, to Imperial for aerospace engineering, and then to the University of Bristol, Bath. I believe that's all 5 that I did. And I got into University of Bristol and Bath. Those were the 2 options that I had. The Imperial math exam is also quite impossibly difficult. And then for the US, so that's that whole process. And the thing is, you have to write your personal statement for the UK. Cambridge also requires a little extra paragraph that you're supposed to give in. As I mentioned before, the Cambridge, at least engineering, but I think they have tests for all of their different subjects, but they usually require an extra entrance exam, and then after that you get an interview. Imperial is the same, depending on the subject as well. And then, so that sort of sums up the UK process, I would say. Then in the US, you have your Common App. The Common App essay, I believe we started prepping for that in about March of première, just so that you have it finished by summer, and then afterwards you have a bunch of supplemental essays to write, depending on the college. I applied to Cornell, Brown, University of, Johns Hopkins as well, Northeastern, somewhere else. Brown, did I say?
Yeah, Cornell.
I'm blanking on where else I applied. I think those are the main schools, and I got into Northeastern and to George Washington as well.
Okay.
I think that's all the schools I applied to. But they all require supplemental essays. Usually each one so the Common App is about like 800 words, and all of the supplemental ones are about like 300 to 400 words, and they're little essays that require, especially for the US, I think one of the things that you have to consider is that the UK and the US look for very different things in terms of their essays. The UK looks for a much more functional kind of, why are you fit for the subject that you're applying for?
Academic.
Yeah, and very sort of academic writing, and not necessarily focused on sort of who you are. Whereas the US wants a very identity-driven kind of style of writing, and it's very, very different, and it's a very, I would say, niche writing style that you have to get the hang of, because what the US wants is a very sort of, they all almost want like a movie style kind of description of who you are.
Main character type.
Yeah, kind of.
And did you do interviews for America or the UK?
Well, I would have had to in the UK had I gotten past the exam process. In the US, oh yes, I applied to Wesleyan and I got in as well.
Okay.
For the US, I did an interview for Wesleyan, but the thing is, in the US, the interviews are their weight in your application is very, very low. They're usually like alumni interviews, and they usually, people see them more as like they'll be like a sort of tick box of like your interest in the school, because if the school sees that you've done an interview with someone who's an alumni, then they'll be like, oh, he's actually interested in our school, but they won't actually look at the interview to see what you said.
Oh, that's interesting. And that's the case for like Ivy League universities too?
I would say majoritarily yes. I'm not in
Of
their
course,
application
right,
process,
right.
but usually the interviews in the U.S. matter much less
Than in the UK, which
yeah,
is very
yeah,
academic and
yeah.
it's about your subject.
If you get an interview like for Cambridge or Oxford, for example, most of your application is weighted on that, I would say.
Yeah, right. Because it's like steps you get through.
Exactly, yeah.
And you mentioned that you applied for aerospace engineering in one of the schools. Was that hard to kind of like include in your personal statement, which there's one for all the subjects that you apply for? And was it not too like specific to that subject, or it was you kind of were
No,
able to?
because so the Cambridge and Oxford both know that when you're applying to them, you're applying to other UK schools as well. I'll just let him. Yes, they know that you're applying to other schools as well, and that you're applying for other subjects. And so, if you're applying to Cambridge for engineering, for example, but you're talking about aerospace engineering, it's not an issue because they know that you're applying to aerospace for the other subjects, and that like you're still passionate about engineering anyways. And no matter what, you're going to be learning very similar things.
Mm-hmm.
So, for my personal statement in the UK, it wasn't really a huge consideration to me. It was very easy to sort of incorporate the fact that I wanted to do engineering, and aerospace was specific enough.
Mm-hmm.
And if anything, they like it when you have a niche, or not a niche passion, but just you
You know what you want.
Yeah, you're centered and you're focused on what you're passionate about.
And to kind of go over it briefly in a few words, what do you mention in your personal statement? Like, do you say why you're fit for the subject? Why are you interested in this subject in this university? How does that work?
Yeah. So I think I mentioned a lot of my like extracurricular activity or summer activities that I did that were related to aerospace.
Mm-hmm.
You mention usually in your personal statement books that you read, or like literature just in general that you read about your subject. Yeah, it's an academic exercise where you're sort of proving why you're fit for that subject and why you're really interested in that subject. I don't know. I think personal statements vary. It depends on on the person, and it depends on how much you've done for the subject also, because sometimes you can't always say a whole lot of stuff. And also the academic counselors at the UGM can probably tell you more and better pointed advice.
Yeah.
But yeah, so my personal statement was more or less just me sort of like talking about the activities and different things that I've done, and like how my passion also where it originated from.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And why would you say you chose this school, Polytechnique, overall from all the other schools you could have gone to?
So I would say there's sort of three-ish main factors. One, the fact that well, one, it's cheap in comparison to the U.S. and in comparison to the UK. I also applied to. I was actually choosing between McGill and here. Um, I would say it's much cheaper for, especially even for international students. We pay something like 20k. Oh no, sorry, 16k. And EU citizens pay like 13k. I think they raised the prices a bit, but it's still quite reasonable. And just in comparison to the 80k that you spend a year in the US, this is a much better deal. Two, I wanted to stay in France. I would like to get my French citizenship eventually, and I like France, I like French, and I wanted to continue that here, and I don't regret that at all. I think it's cool because we get interaction as well with the engineering program, and I can continue sort of like speaking French with people. And then three, I wasn't entirely sure that I wanted to do engineering. I had a moment last year where I was like, I'm not sure that I love physics, and I also quite like humanities, and was thinking about maybe doing something in public policy or economics. And here you have the option to choose, and I would say that also broadly speaking, no matter which of the majors you decide to do, math, physics, math, economics, or math, computer science, you have the opportunity to do something later that's different in a master's, and math really opens the door to a lot of things. So for me, that was sort of my main focus of like, oh, I don't necessarily have to do something very ultra specific like aerospace engineering and then kind of be cornered into only doing that industry, or having to find another way to do some kind of other education to kind of branch out of that. Whereas here I get sort of a broad overview that's also very academically intense. Yeah, but that allows me to sort of do whatever I want. Yeah, and also the vibe I think that I got from this place. I went to like an open day sort of tour, like a long time ago before COVID even, and I really liked the sense that I got from the people that I talked to, who were all very, I don't know, warm, friendly. Yeah, I don't know. I felt the community spirit, and I was attracted to that.
Would you advise people to go on campus if they have the chance on like open doors days and see the school for themselves?
Yeah, 100%. I'm actually not sure that they ever restarted the open days
Oh.
like stuff. They do, however, they're unfortunately currently they're a bit understaffed, um, and they need to, in my opinion, need to do some revamping of their website and advertising of the program, which they're. But they do have campus tours that you can email them asking them to like give you one, and as long as you pick a time slot, they will gladly take you around campus. And you can also email on the website. I believe there's a section that's called campus tours. You can email the person that's responsible there. They have a bunch of open time slots that you can choose, and ask for a campus tour. And there's student ambassadors who also give them. And of course, you can also contact any, like if you have people that you know. I'm happy and open to give campus tours. And
You'd be happy to if
talks.
people contact you from
Yeah,
the
of course.
podcast viewers.
Of course,
That'd be
yeah.
awesome. That'd be really nice of you. Okay, and you also mentioned that how despite it being the bachelor program, not the prépa program, it still gives you a broad overview of kind of the subjects of math, physics. So and are you thinking of taking the math and economics one, or are you still kind of wondering?
Uh, right now, I'm leaning towards math and physics.
Okay.
I actually really quite like the way physics is taught here.
Mhm.
I liked it less when I was in IB, and I like it much more now. It's very difficult, but it's super interesting. It is definitely abstract. I would say that one of the things that I know some people have complained about in the past, as long as if you're interested in engineering, it's quite an abstract program. The math that we do has lots of applications, but some of it is quite um, math for the sake of math, I would say.
Okay.
And you really have to enjoy doing math, because some of it is really, you won't immediately see how it's useful for something. It is sort of cerebral, and like this is just math. And yeah, but I personally think I'm going to take math and physics. Our major decision is actually coming up quite soon. I'm still relatively undecided, but I think I'm going to take math and physics in the end.
Okay, and I've also read about the bachelor program. I'm not sure if it applies for this one or for the prépa, but probably this one. But basically, in the third year, tell me if I'm wrong, you can travel abroad
Exchange.
and do like in the fall semester do like 8 weeks of a research internship
Yeah.
in the universities of like Toronto, Berkeley, UC Berkeley, King's College in London, or even University of Melbourne.
Yeah, so in the third year, so there's two things that you talked about. One is your semester abroad. So I would say about half the students choose to go abroad, and half the students stay here, because there's also grade requirements that you need to pass in order to be able to go on exchange. But the exchange program, depending on the university that you go to, is about 4 to 5 months, usually anywhere from like starting from August to about December, January. And they really have lots of choices. You mentioned all of those different universities, but they also have universities in Asia. There's Hong Kong, Korea, University of Tokyo. There's universities in South America, in Mexico, in Beirut. There's really a huge variety of places to choose from, and as well as all around Europe. And yeah, so you do your four sort of months over there, and then afterwards you come back, or sometimes you go somewhere else and you do about 8 weeks of an internship. Usually, that might mean an internship in a company, but usually it means more of like an internship in a lab, because the goal of the internship is afterwards you write your bachelor thesis, which is your sort of culmination of a research project, where then you present it to a jury, with like an oral presentation, and you have your entire thesis that usually physics majors would do it in a lab. Econ majors might also do it in an economics lab, where they're doing some kind of economics research with maybe with a professor or something like that. And with CS, sort of the same thing. Yeah.
And now to talk more about, the application process, in terms of applying for the bachelor program, how does that work? What does it consist of? You mentioned the interviews. Is there also essays that you can do? If you could tell us more about that.
Yeah, so the way the application process works is there's 3 waves of applications. There's one in the beginning of the year, something from like September to December, another one from December to about March, and then another final one from March to about May, I would say.
Is that considered like early applications and then?
No, and you can also apply through Parcoursup. I
Okay.
don't actually remember how that application works, but
Okay.
it's not they don't really prioritize one round or the other. I applied in the second round. If you apply earlier, you're, I guess, a little bit more, you're likelier to have a more guaranteed spot, I guess, like faster, but there's no real there's no preference, I would say, on the admin side of like they accept more people or less people from one of the rounds. They accept qualified candidates and within each of the rounds, and that's sort of how it goes. Then the application itself, you submit a CV that details like all of your different activities, and usually, what else do they want? Like, yeah, extracurricular activities. They want they ask you to fill out your own sort of personal math evaluation where you detail your ability in different math subjects. They ask about I think that's about what they ask in the CV, and then they ask 3 essay questions as well. They're very similar to the U.S. supplements. They're 3 questions of about like 300 words. I think mine were like, tell me about yourself, tell us and your roommates about yourself, tell someone who is not in science a scientific story that inspires inspires them, and why would you want to come to the Bachelor? And very self-explanatory. And then after you do all of that, you'll be invited for an interview. The interview lasts about 50 minutes, 20 of which are a sort of personal talk. It really varies. I've heard lots of people had, someone who asked them about their favorite scientist or mathematician, talking about like current events or something like that, or talking about what they're passionate within science. My interviewer just asked me different experiences that I have in my CV and asked me to tell her about them in more detail.
During the whole interview, so there was no like have surprise questions.
No, there wasn't. I wouldn't
Okay.
say there were any surprise questions. I mean, I think it depends on, again, it depends on the person.
Interview.
So that's the sort of 20 minutes of the personal interview, and then you have 30 minutes of math,
Okay.
where they ask you. It depends. They have a little question book where they give you different math questions, and I would say the most important thing is that you explain what you're doing while
Right.
you're doing it, because they want to see how you think, not necessarily how well you can solve the problem, because often they're quite difficult. I don't think I solved anything actually. Most of the time I needed help, but that's fine as long as you're sort of going through the process of like, okay, here's what I need to do, here's what I think I need to do, but I don't know how to do this. Like, ask your interviewer for help, and you sort of walk through the process of solving problems together. And I think the most important part again is just showing how you think.
Showing your reasoning. I've heard of that, because if you're like blocked and you don't say anything, you're not helping them, and they don't realize like what are you to help them. Basically, you mentioned that it's not through the Bachelor program. So how would that work? How would you apply for the Bachelor program?
So it's directly through their website. I think actually Parcoursup, I wouldn't suggest applying through Parcoursup because I think it's much more difficult. I know there are some people who are here through it. But I think it's much better if you apply directly through their website. They have their own like application portal on their website that you can apply for, and you can check all of the deadlines directly there.
Okay, nice. So that's good to know. The best ways to apply. You mentioned that they're not really clear and kind of like transparent with their application, like how they assess you. But you did give us an idea of the back results you have to get, especially for IB in your case.
And I was just gonna say, like, I don't mean to say that they're not necessarily transparent.
Right.
It's just that they
There's
don't have specific requirements, whereas some of it's like the U.S. Where they ask for good academic performance, but they're not gonna say you need this number grade in order to get in.
No, you're right. It's not that they don't want to show that there isn't just like a grade. It's maybe we can say it's more holistic.
Exactly. It is a holistic process. Yeah.
Okay. And do they look at like your what in French is called contrôle continu, basically your grades during the year, or what kind of how much value does
Yeah.
those grades have compared to your
So
IB results?
so yeah, you have to submit a high school transcript, which I think is your contrôle continu. Um, yeah, so you need to submit your high school transcript with all of the different grades that you've been getting throughout your high school career. I think that's sort of more important again to them. They don't necessarily. I think I submitted my back results, but I think I might have submitted my predicted grades as well. But for the most part, I think they're just looking at your academic performance throughout, over continuous time rather than um, your predicted
Just
or
one
final
time
back grades.
where
Yeah.
Okay. Like consistency in your
Yeah,
in your
exactly.
rigor.
exactly.
Would you mind sharing your back results with us?
Yeah, sure. I had a 43 out of 45 on my
Wow.
IB, but for example, I had seven in math and 7 in history, but 6 in physics.
Okay.
But I'm still thinking
Here.
doing physics. So.
Okay, yeah, but it's not a problem, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of the
No,
top
definitely
grade, 6,
not.
7.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do they look at your extracurricular activities?
Yes. So within your CV that you submit,
Right.
you're asked to write a bunch of. They ask for extracurricular activities, both like academic, non-academic, and then as well as like volunteering and community service. So yes, they do look at that.
So I know, I mean, you've been my head chair last year, and that was a big part, I guess, of your, your academic life, your school life. And I was wondering if that's something that you could have applied in your application, and that kind of made your application more valuable, despite it being more humanitarian than what you're doing now, which is math and physics.
Yeah, I mean, I think 100%. I think they were interested in
A well-rounded student.
Yeah, I think they are interested in a well-rounded student. I mean, I think again here the importance is on the math. You really do need to be good at math to be here. But at the same time, they are looking for students who, excuse me, are going to make their student body more diverse and interesting.
Yeah.
Especially because I think one of the goals of the bachelor program is to make École Polytechnique more visible abroad. Because currently it's not very well known, I would say, and they want to try and do that. And this is one of the ways in which they're sort of disseminating their alumni to go abroad and talk about École Polytechnique. And so with that in mind, they want students who are excellent in math, but also who are going to be interesting, make the campus life interesting, make the student body sort of more interesting.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think extracurricular activities really do add value to your application.
Yeah, and one of the ways they do that is by sending you're abroad, and then you meet new other people, and yeah. True. And do you know how long this program has been?
Yeah, it's quite young.
It's quite I
it's
believe really popular now.
Yeah.
And like with universities like Sciences Po also.
Yeah. I believe it was started in 2017. I think the first graduating class was 2020.
Yeah.
So it's very young.
It's
It is very, very young.
Yeah, very popular. So that's nice. And you probably did other things in high school, which we could totally talk about. But like from what I understand, like it's a lot of responsibility being a head chair. So that's a big part of your high school life. Would you mind talking more about debate? How you started? How you went into that? Is that something you did in the U.S. back in America?
Yeah, sure. So I started debate when I was in my first year of high school in the U.S. So I did 1 year of high school in the U.S. before I moved to France. And there, I wasn't actually thinking that I was going to do debate. I was more interested in the robotics team at first. I didn't end up doing it. But I went, the school that I was at in New York was called the Bronx High School of Science. And they were one of the top ranked high schools in debate in the entire country. And there was one form of debate that really spoke to me. It was called congressional debate. Where you debate on sort of fake proposed legislation, and I thought it was super interesting, and I really got into it. I did like a debate camp over the summer, and yeah, I don't know. I think it really developed both my argumentation, speaking, and like critical thinking skills, like all at once. And honestly, I use just within that 1 year. I use so many of the different skills that I learned within that 1 year about speaking and argumentation all the time, and I think it's made me a much smarter person in that regard. And then I wanted to continue that, so I came to UGM and was excited about doing debate in Montpellier, and yeah, went to a few conferences even before COVID, which was exciting.
Which one did you? Which ones did you go to?
I went to H-Man in Second.
In Madrid.
No, in Boston.
Oh, H-Man. Right.
Yeah.
In Boston. Wow.
And then I went to HMC in. I didn't actually go to HMC. It was online.
COVID. Yeah.
But I got to go to H-Man right before COVID.
Yeah, that's really it's really big. Like you don't. It's hard to like get your voice and.
That is true.
That is true. Yeah, but that's what I've heard of. My chairs went there. At the beginning of this year. They're Adele and Paul.
Oh, okay.
Right. So, yeah. I went to HMC in Madrid like this year. It was one of my first conferences, which was really left me a big impression. And yeah, I was wondering like it didn't make you want to like go into politics, or like you said, you were really attracted by the congressional debates. That's what HMC is. It's like the Europe Congress Europe. Despite that, you still wanted to do science.
There's a part of me that definitely wants to go into policy making.
Yeah.
But in my mind, this doesn't stop me from still doing that.
Right.
For me, it's much easier. And another thing is that like in today's world, quantitative backgrounds are very sought after, especially when you're doing things like economics or even policy making. Like a lot of that requires a lot of data analysis. So people look for those kinds of people who have a quantitative background, and I think that helps a lot. And so for me, the like knowing that I wanted to at least at some point in my life do science and being passionate about it, I would rather pursue that right now, and then maybe in the future for a master's degree, take something that's more humanities related, or not even necessarily humanities related, but then afterwards be able to go into a field that has to do with policy or with public speaking, or something that's more humanities related. Just because you're doing math and physics now doesn't mean that I'm going to be a theoretical physicist later.
Yeah, it's really interesting what you're saying, because I think people are starting to get that, and it's important to consider that when you're choosing. We're really young, and like it's sometimes hard to understand like what we want to do. But it's true that a lot of people, even though they want to do like humanitarian kind of subjects, they still take like maths B.
Yeah.
So that's definitely very important to have as a base, so you don't close any doors.
And I think the key thing about math specifically is that it teaches you a way of thinking, and like a logical sort of process of thinking about problem solving that I think is quite unique. And I think that you don't necessarily get in humanities studies. And again, another thing that you were saying that I think is super true is that we're super young, and even me, I'm still super young, and even my major decision now, whether it's physics, CS, or economics, it really doesn't close that many doors, especially now. Like there's so many interdisciplinary jobs that require lots of different kinds of knowledge, and knowledge that can also be learned. So no matter what you end up deciding to choose, it's not closing a door really on anything.
Yeah, absolutely. And what other extracurricular activities did you do in high school, and that you mentioned on your application?
Yeah, so I played at the conservatory in the 10th and the 17th. I played the trumpet. I did some volunteering for Koh-Ed in Second, where I taught English at the foyer de Cornell. What else did I do? I was a peer leader with Madame le Maire.
I mean, that's...
I think that's more or less. I was délégué at some point.
Yeah. And that's great. It really shows involvement in the community with volunteering, and that you have passions outside of what you do. And actually, co-ed's something that really interests me. I would love to do that. How did that work? Like, did you have to prepare your classes? You taught math or science?
No, I taught English.
English, right?
So I think it has changed a bit since I was there. I was there when Anna Ko was the founder, was actually there. So they had different sections of the organization, where they had like an education section that was sort of where I was part of. And yes, we sort of prepared like little English classes. I mean, it was quite informal. There was no necessarily set curriculum. We were kind of making it as we went. To be honest, like I tried to sort of create like a little English curriculum using like a specific book that they had. But it was difficult also because a lot of the students had very different levels because it was a free class at the end at a community center. Yeah, and I think they offer other kinds of things. They offer like science classes, I believe, to younger students at Eugene. I know, what's his face, Mr. McGregor. I think that's.
I've never heard of him.
No, okay, well then, I think he's a science teacher, and I think he was the one in charge of like
the
helping
science.
Koh-Ed. Yeah.
Do you teach adults or children?
It was a mix. We had one elderly guy, like one grandpa kind of stuff, and like one teenager too. Like yeah, it was really everyone.
And they're necessarily like immigrants, or they're
no, they're French. Some of them were French. Some of them I think were also like from other places, but.
And it's free, so it's voluntary.
Yeah, it was voluntary.
And you mentioned like the volunteering work, and I guess that's something that's valued by Polytechnique in your application. Did you participate in any like Olympiads, competitions, won any awards?
No, actually, I did not. There are lots of people here who did. Lots of people here who are like ranked like super high within like. There's especially the Romanians and the Serbians. They're crazy in math. Like they have done all of the Olympiads, and like half the classes this year that we're taking, they've already like done. But no, I didn't participate in any Olympiads.
Okay, and you don't think it's not a problem?
No, I don't think that's an inhibiting factor at all.
And I was wondering.
It doesn't hurt for sure. If you want to do an Olympiad, go for it. But
it's really impressive.
Yeah.
I think in America that's something they really consider like.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, here they value it. I mean, everyone does. Like, it's not it definitely doesn't hurt.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I've just because I've talked to a student who she's now in Cambridge, and she said that just listing kind of like, especially in your personal statement or like in interviews, like kind of the awards that you get isn't really useful if you don't explain how it's connected to what you want to do, the subject, and those like what you learn. That's just something I wanted to mention. And so we talked about the program you could do in your third year abroad, and I was wondering about like your future plans that you might have. Are you considering like doing a master's afterwards? Do you know where you would want to do it, or like?
Yeah, those are the big questions.
Right.
So for my exchange semester, to be honest, I'm most interested in having like a fun experience somewhere cool. Yeah. So preferably, I would love to go to Asia or maybe to South America. And that also depends because exchange, there's limited slots with the partnership schools that Polytechnique has, and so it depends on your grades. So also it'll just sort of depend on what I can get. Then for my future plans in masters, I think it depends. I think one of the things that I might be interested in is doing. In the U.S., they have a few programs that do masters in science, technology, and policy, which I think would be interesting because it would still be relatively quantitative, but with a sort of policy mindset. And the bachelor program is sort of aimed at making you do a master's directly after, I would say. But some people go to do like a year of work or an internship or something like that. And I'm not 100% sure that I would necessarily want to do a master's degree directly after, but I don't know. We'll see. Like that's sort of in the future, and maybe I'll do something like development studies. I really have no idea right now.
Of course. No, I mean no one's sure, but it's nice to get an idea of like for students what you can do after. What's kind of the path that you could take.
and people really do like, and then in terms of where I would want to go, I think I would either the US or the UK, but like people really do a broad variety of different things. A lot of people from like physics or CS end up doing finance, like masters in finance afterwards. They really go everywhere. There's people who go to the US and very, very top schools like MIT, Caltech, and same with the UK and ETH in Switzerland,
and that's something I didn't really ask you in the beginning, because I guess you came in later to our school and you did the IB program. But what languages do you speak? Because you mentioned how you want to go to Asia, and we do Chinese since like 5th grade or something, like mandatory. So that's something a lot of people want to do because like they want to use this skills that they got. What about you?
I mean, I speak English, Russian, French, and a little bit of Spanish.
A little bit, right? Because
it's not. Yeah.
No, it's nice, and that's one of the things I think that is really attractive for Polytechnique. Like you said, people from all around the world, international students.
And you have lots of people who speak lots of different languages. Like there's a huge community of like Lebanese and Moroccans who speak both Arabic and French. And,
kind of multiculturality, like
Yeah,
in UGM.
it's very, very multicultural. I would say even more diverse than UGM.
Yeah, of course, because it's a bigger school.
Yeah.
And to kind of end this interview, but this is not the last question, but I was wondering, kind of more like specific tips if you have for our listeners on like studying, because I mean, the IB program is a very rigorous program. Then you're doing Polytechnique, like math, physics. It's really challenging, and like you mentioned, like sometimes it can be difficult to accept the grades that you get once you're more challenged. So do you have tips for like working, for being consistent, and to kind of like doing your best in school and university after?
I would say, especially in math and physics, and those kinds of subjects, but really anywhere, is like consistent work is more important than cramming, which is much easier said than done, and I'm very guilty of not following that advice. But especially with something like math, you are not going to be able to learn it in a night, and like a lot of those kinds of things, especially math is about like seeing patterns in some ways, especially like for problem solving. Like if you see a certain subject, just because you solved like a few problems doesn't mean that you're going to necessarily be able to reproduce the same kind of thing. Whereas if you've solved a lot of different kinds of questions, you'll be able to see some of the same patterns and be able to reproduce what you're supposed to reproduce. So yeah, I think the most important thing is consistent like work, in studying, and in IB was the same. Like, you know, the work that I had, especially up until the exams, like consistent work every day is important. And I would say it's still as important here as it was in IB. And like that's the only way to really succeed.
And how many hours? Like I know it's specific, but how many hours would you say is good for like everyday math to be consistent?
In high school,
Yeah,
I mean,
high
I would
school
say about half an hour at
half
least.
an hour every day. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, depending on the day. Like sometimes you can have like a longer session, but like and especially like do your homework. In IB, it's easier to get away with kind of not doing your homework, because usually there'll just be like a few textbook questions that you're supposed to solve, and you can kind of get away with not doing them. I suggest doing them because like you'll be confused if you don't. And then otherwise, yeah, I'd say 30 minutes a day.
In high school, a lot of like student work is also like mixed with extracurricular activities, responsibilities like outside of school, and that's really like important for I know for U.S. applications it's like indispensable. How would you advise students to kind of combine those two things, manage their time and resources?
I mean, you have to figure out the right schedule for yourself.
Yeah.
I personally liked overloading my schedule.
Yeah.
I also like being occupied a lot, and like the extracurricular activities give me, I think, sort of extra things to do, and I enjoy doing them. But it's true, you have to find the balance. You have to find a way to implement that into your life. To be honest, I don't necessarily have very specific advice for there. It's just you make sure you don't overload yourself completely, because also if you're doing too much, you won't really be able to focus on everything that you need to be able to focus on with as much intensity and the sort of effort that it deserves. But yeah, I don't have very specific advice. It's just you have to find the right work ethic for yourself.
Yeah, it's personal.
Yeah.
I would say, I mean, I definitely haven't gone through that, but I would say probably like do sports on the side to kind of like.
No, do sports and find time to spend with friends as well.
And family,
That's very important. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And last but not least, if you could give your younger self one piece of advice, what would you say?
I saw this question and I didn't think about it.
It's okay. We can have some time. You can think about it.
No. What would I say?
It can be about anything, like applications.
I would say, like, one of the biggest things is, don't be afraid that whatever your major or whatever decision that you end up making for your college life or even for your bac is going to have some sort of like ripple effect on your life forever, because that's just not the case. I think no matter what, it's very hard to close doors, especially at this stage in your life. You will always have opportunities that are open to you, and to switch. I know someone, for example, who took the math and physics major and is next year going to become a patent lawyer. So the opportunities for you to sort of not do necessarily what you were doing originally, or to change paths, or to be interested in a lot of different things, I think is, if anything, a strength, and you're really not closing any doors by whatever you decide to do. And I think I didn't necessarily understand that. And another thing is math opens the door to everything. So
Right.
I do recommend doing math.
Yeah. No, the thing about choice is definitely something that stresses people out.
Yeah.
Especially at our young age.
And I think one of the nice things about this program is that math, especially, like I think unfortunately, if you do certain humanities degrees, you're never going to be able to really do engineering.
Absolutely.
Because you won't have the skill set. Whereas if you do engineering, you probably could do something more humanities related. And I think math, again, is one of the things that really enables you to go anywhere and do anything.
Well, thank you very much, Sasha, for agreeing to do this interview.
Thank you for
coming on the podcast. I loved our conversation. I learned a lot of new things, and I hope that's the case for our viewers. Thank you very much. Good luck in your studies, in your continuation. Thank you, Sasha. Awesome. Perfect. Thank you for tuning in on this episode of the Anxious Scholar podcast. See you in 2 weeks for the next interview, and don't miss out on any additional information on our Instagram @The Anxious Scholar.